year is 1481. The Ottoman Empire, a titan that stretches from the Danube to the Euphrates, is once again holding its breath. In the ornate but suffocating atmosphere of the Palace of Bursa, two half-brothers, both sons of the recently deceased Sultan Mehmed II, lay sleeping. One was the pragmatic favored son, Bayezid. The other was the charismatic ambitious challenger, SMM. They were royalty, but they were also pawns in a terrifying game of succession. By the time the call to morning prayer echoed across the city, only one of them would still be breathing. The other was dead, strangled silently in his sleep, not by disease or a foreign assassin, but by a single, tightly pulled silk cord, the preferred instrument of the royal executioner. This was not a backroom murder. This was not a palace conspiracy gone wrong. This was law. This was the law of fratricide, the brutal blood-soaked decree that forced every new sultan to begin his reign by executing his own brothers. It was the ultimate cold-blooded political calculation designed to prevent a civil war by ensuring a royal massacre. But how did a law so monstrous come to exist? Why did it last for centuries? And what was the horrifying cost paid by the men who ruled the world? To understand the law of fratricide, you must first understand the anarchy it was designed to prevent. The problem of Ottoman succession was, for the first century of the empire, a guarantee of self-destruction. The Ottoman tradition, derived from earlier Turkish and Mongol customs, stated that sovereignty was a collective heritage of the entire ruling family. The Sultan ruled, but every male relative had a legitimate claim to a piece of that power. The problem was, this meant power could not be peacefully inherited. It had to be violently seized. The crisis reached its absolute peak in 1402, decades before Mehmed the Conqueror. The great Mongol warlord Timur smashed the Ottoman army at the Battle of Ankara and captured the reigning Sultan. Yildirim Bayezid the Sultan died in captivity, and without a clear successor, the Ottoman state dissolved into a decade-long civil war known as the Ottoman Interregnum. Four of Bayezid's sons, Isa, Musa, Suleiman, and Memdal, declared themselves Sultan, controlling different fragments of the empire. For 11 agonizing years, the four brothers and their armies tore the fledgling state apart. Cities were razed, provinces were lost to rivals, and the entire momentum of Ottoman expansion into Europe was halted. Imagine the entire stability of your world dissolving because four ambitious men couldn't agree on who got the throne. This was the existential nightmare that haunted every Ottoman statesman. The trauma of the interregnum taught the imperial family one indelible lesson: multiplicity of heirs equals destruction. Mehmed eventually emerged as the victor, having executed or defeated his brothers. But even after the chaos, the problem persisted. Every subsequent sultan faced immediate armed rebellion from his surviving male relatives. The throne was essentially a target, and the prize for failure was not just death but the dismemberment of the empire. This tradition of survival of the fittest was often known as the custom of the dynasty. But a custom is unstable. It can be ignored. What the Ottomans needed was not custom but cold, hard, unassailable law. And that law would be codified by the man whose legacy demands both AEW and revulsion: Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople in 1453, was not merely a warrior. He was a political genius. He understood that an empire built to last must have perfect stability at its core. He had witnessed the constant threat of civil war firsthand, and he wasn't going to let that instability jeopardize his imperial project. In the 1470s, he commissioned the Kanun-name Ioli Osman, or the Law Book of the House of Osman. This was a foundational document outlining everything from taxation to court protocol. Tucked deep within this monumental code was the infamous decree that weaponized familial murder. His exact words were chillingly unambiguous, but they were phrased as a political necessity. Whichever of my sons gets the sultanate, it is fitting for him to kill his brothers for the order of the world. The majority of the ulama religious scholars have approved this. Let action be taken accordingly. The philosophical concept justifying this horror was Nizam-ı Alem, the order of the world. In this view, the sultanate, the single absolute authority, was essential for the spiritual and political survival of the Muslim world. The lives of a few princes, even innocent ones, were a trivial price to pay for the preservation of the state. The empire was bigger and more important than the family. By linking the law to the approval of the ulama, Mehmed elevated the act from a crime to a sanctioned religious duty. It was the ultimate argument of utility. The good of the state outweighs the sanctity of individual life. Now, the incoming sultan was not executing his brothers out of personal hatred or greed. He was executing them to fulfill his sacred duty to the state. This removed the moral burden from the individual and placed it squarely on the shoulders of the law itself. Mehmed himself provided the first high-profile case for his new law decades earlier. When his father, Murad II, passed away, the new Sultan Mehmed was only a teenager. His younger half-brother, an infant named Prince Mustafa, was seen as a future rallying point for rivals. Under Mehmed's orders, the infant was strangled. The law was brutal, efficient, and once codified, impossible to escape. The method of execution was just as important as the law itself. It was almost always carried out by strangulation using a silk cord or bowstring. Why the silk cord? It was a ritualistic necessity. According to tradition, royal blood could not be spilled on the ground. To spill the blood of the House of Osman was to commit a profound sacrilege that threatened the health of the entire dynasty. Strangulation, while brutal, ensured a clean death, preserving the sacredness of the lineage even as it destroyed it. The executioners were specially chosen servants of the palace, often deaf-mutes from the Janissary corps. This selection was based on necessity. Secrecy, mutes could not share information. Ensuring the horrific details of the prince's last moments remained confined to the deepest parts of the palace. Impartiality, they were trained to follow orders instantly, without questioning the morality or the identity of their victim. They were machines of duty. The signal for the execution to commence often came from the Kisler Uga, the chief black eunuch, one of the most powerful figures in the entire empire. When a sultan died, the new heir would immediately dispatch the execution squad. The unsuspecting princes, confined to their rooms in the palace, were approached and offered a final ritual cushion of comfort, followed immediately by the silk cord. The victim would typically be offered a ceremonial meal, a final gesture of royal respect, before the executioners performed their deadly duty. The body would then be wrapped and delivered to the royal necropolis, where it would be buried alongside the sultan who had just ordered their death. This ritual ensured that the entire act from the sultan's decree to the final burial was performed under the guise of imperial ceremony, distancing it from simple murder and enshrining it as a necessary function of the state. The silence of the executioners and the softness of the silk only magnified the chilling, bureaucratic precision of the system. After the codification of the law, the first major test came with the succession of Mehmed II's sons in 1481. This was the conflict that opened our story. The devastating war between Prince Bayezid and Prince Sem Bayezid the Elder was seen as reserved and scholarly, favored by the senior bureaucrats and the conservative religious factions. Sem the Younger was energetic, charismatic, and popular with the military, the classic dangerous challenger. The moment Mehmed II died, the race was on. Sem seized Bursa, the old capital, and offered a compromise: split the empire in two. Sem would rule the eastern Anatolian provinces, and Bayezid would rule the Western European territories. Bayezid's response was swift and absolute: a challenge to the Nizam-ı Alem. Division would lead to war, and war would lead to the end of the empire. He flatly refused, mobilizing his forces. In a massive battle near the city of Yenisei, Bayezid's forces crushed Sem's army. Sem fled, knowing that if he remained in Ottoman territory, his execution was imminent. This is where the story shifts from a palace murder to an international geopolitical nightmare. Sem found refuge, not with a friendly nation, but with the Knights Hospitaller on the island of Rhodes, the sworn enemies of the Ottoman Empire. The Knights, led by Pir Dobasin, saw Sem, not as a guest, but as a golden hostage. They instantly realized his value as a permanent check against Ottoman aggression. The Knights soon moved Sem to Europe, where he was shuffled between different powers: France, Rome, and Naples. Everywhere Sem went, he was treated with deceptive reverence, but he was always under guard. He was the perpetual sultan waiting, the sword of Damocles hanging over Constantinople. For the next 13 years, Sultan Bayezid II was paralyzed. He could not launch a major invasion of Europe, knowing that any setback would immediately trigger Sem's release, plunging the empire back into the civil war that Mehmed had died trying to prevent. Bayezid was forced to pay the knights a massive annual stipend to keep his brother alive, and in captivity a cynical form of life insurance for his throne. Sem was history's most powerful pawn, a prince of the Ottoman house held captive by its enemies. The European powers used him to extort wealth, political favors, and military concessions from Bayezid. In 1495, the nightmare finally ended. Sem, then held in Naples, died. It is widely suspected he was poisoned by agents of the new Pope Alexander VI. Under pressure war, perhaps a hefty payment from Sultan Bayezid, the law of fratricide, in this case, took 14 years and required the intervention of half of Europe to be completed. The Sem episode perfectly illustrated Mehmed's original logic. The brother who survived posed a greater threat to the Ottoman state than any external power. If Mehmed II codified the law, Sultan Selim I, known as Yavuz the Grim, perfected its execution with ruthless, unsparing efficiency. Selim's ascension was a violent struggle against his own father Bayezid II and his brothers. He learned the lesson of the interregnum better than anyone. Selim viewed any ambiguity in the line of succession as a mortal sin against the state. His reign, though short, was defined by military conquest and internal purges of unprecedented scale. Having already defeated and executed two of his brothers, Ahmed and Korkat, Selim ensured there would be absolutely no risk from the next generation. Upon securing the throne in 1512, he ordered the execution of his own 5-year-old nephew, a son of the already dead Prince Ahmed. But Selim went even further. He extended the law of fratricide to his own male children. He had several sons, and he systematically executed all but one Suleiman. This ensured that when Selim died, there would be one and only one heir left standing. This was the ultimate expression of the Nizam-ı Alem, the absolute elimination of all competing claims to the throne. Selim's rule was a terrifying success. By the time he died in 1520, he left behind an empire twice the size, completely secure internally, and with an unchallenged single successor, Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman inherited a treasury filled with gold and an empire unburdened by civil war, allowing him to launch the golden age of Ottoman history. The sheer savagery of Selim's actions was shocking even by Ottoman standards, but his legacy proved the terrifying efficacy of the law of fratricide. The most stable and successful era of the empire was secured by the most ruthless application of the decree. The peak of the law's horror, the moment it transitioned from brutal politics into outright dynasty-wide trauma, occurred in 1595. This is the incident of the 19 Coffins. The reigning Sultan, Murad III, died, leaving behind a sprawling harem of wives and concubines who had produced a staggering number of sons. His eldest son, Mehmed III, arrived in Istanbul to claim his title. Mehmed was a man who had grown up watching the intense rivalry and paranoia of the Haroma, perfect breeding ground for fear. Mehmed III's first order as Sultan was not a military mobilization or a diplomatic decree, but a command to his executioners: "Find all my brothers." In a single horrifying night, 19 of his brothers and half-brothers were rounded up and brought before him. Their ages ranged from teenagers down to infants, still in the arms of their mothers. The official record notes the despair of the mothers, concubines who had spent their lives climbing the rigid hierarchy of the harem, only to watch their sons, their only source of future security, dragged away to their deaths. The execution was methodical. The executioners were sent in, and the silent work began. The sheer volume of the dead meant the palace was a scene of chaos and mourning. When dawn broke, the scene was one that permanently scarred the Ottoman psyche. 19 small coffins were lined up outside the Hagia Sophia. They were buried alongside their father, the Sultan whose death had sealed their fate. But Mehmed III's actions went beyond the existing law to eliminate any chance of a posthumous claim. He also ordered the drowning of all his father's pregnant concubines in the Bosphorus. This was not fratricide. This was a total annihilation of any potential future rivals. This massacre was a tipping point. The public outcry, even in a society accustomed to the harshness of the Sultanate, was immense. The moral authority of the Nizam-ı Alem was irrevocably damaged. It was clear that the law was no longer stabilizing the empire. It was merely satisfying the paranoia of one man. The sultans themselves recognized that this level of brutality was unsustainable. The law of fratricide finally ended with Sultan Ahmed I in the early 1600s. Ahmed, who ascended at age 13, committed the required executions, but he spared his own brother, Mustafa. Why the change? The primary reason was fear. Ahmed had not yet produced a son, and if he died childless, the entire house of Osman would be extinguished. The continuation of the dynasty became more important than the certainty of succession. The silk cord was retired, replaced by an institution that was arguably less physically brutal, but far more psychologically devastating: the golden cage, or the cafes. The cafes was a beautiful but terrifying prison. It was a secluded complex of lavish apartments within the harem, where princes were confined for their entire lives. They had access to luxury concubines who were immediately checked for pregnancy if the prince died, and food, but they were cut off from all knowledge of the outside world, politics, and warfare. The princes of the cafes were meant to be held and reserved the spare heirs until they were needed. The problem was, when they were needed, they were completely unprepared. The men who emerged from decades of isolation, men like Ibrahim the Mad, were often mentally shattered. Ibrahim, who spent 22 years in the cafes, suffered from severe psychological distress and was prone to fits of violence and irrational behavior. He was an absolute ruler who feared his own shadow. The system had traded stability for sanity. The empire could survive the blood of fratricide, but it could not survive the incompetence of rulers warped by decades of isolation. The sultans were physically secure but politically inept, utterly reliant on the powerful women of the harem and the bureaucracy. This shift to the cafes marked a pivotal moment in Ottoman history, ushering in the long, slow decline of the central authority. The law of fratricide stands as one of the most chilling examples of state pragmatism in history. It began as a necessary evil to save an empire from implosion and ended as a self-inflicted wound that crippled the same empire. Was Mehmed II right? Did the lives of a few children justify the golden age of Suleiman and the century of stability that followed? The Ottoman leaders believed so, sacrificing the humanity of their line for the perpetuity of their state. The legacy is clear. A unified empire purchased with the unforgivable price of family blood? Let me know in the comments below. If you were Sultan, would you choose the silk cord of guaranteed stability or the golden cage of psychological damage?